Good afternoon, and welcome to the First Americas Symposium. I'm Alejandro Werner, the director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. The Institute is a platform for dialogue, research, and impact around the key challenges facing Latin America and the hemisphere. It was established last year from Monica's and Rolando Gonzalez Bunster's vision and transformational gift to the university. With this event, we celebrate our inaugural year, and we gather to reflect on the social and economic challenges that Latin America faces, as well as the need to strengthen and redesign its regional ties and its relationship with the US and Canada. Today, Latin America and the Caribbean face the prospect of another lost decade, the fourth occasion in the last 120 years that our countries do not experience an improvement in living standards within a decade. Also, after 15 years of improvements in income distribution and poverty alleviation, Latin America is facing a reversal. On the positive side, the countries in the region are well placed to contribute to the regional fight against the global fight against climate change due to its large reserves of lithium, copper, other important minerals, and its important availability of sun, wind, and water. Additionally, the region is not at the center of the main geopolitical conflicts currently taking place, making our countries reliable partners in trade, investment, and the digital transformation. However, to take advantage of these opportunities, there is a need to forge new social agreements to tap into the opportunities from a deeper hemispheric integration. We are extremely fortunate to have an incredible group of speakers to reflect and debate these issues. We will start with a panel of three of the most important leaders in our region in the last 3 decades: Luis Alberto Lacalle from Uruguay, José Manuel Santos from Colombia, and Ernesto Zedillo from Mexico. This panel will be moderated by Diana Kapichevsky, Distinguished Associate Professor at the Department of Government at Georgetown University and the incoming Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. We will then move to a conversation with President Clinton on his reflections about his period and the relationship between the US and Latin America. Unfortunately, at the last moment, President Clinton fell ill with COVID, so that part of the program will be through Zoom. We will have a slightly larger panel with the presidents from Latin America, and then we will have the conversation with President Clinton. To close, I want to thank the 30 students who volunteered to organize this event and the staff at the Protocol Office of the University and at the Americas Institute. Again, let me thank all of you for coming, and especially our 3 speakers for being with us today. Please, Diana.
Thanks, Alejandro. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome and express my gratitude to our esteemed guests and to everyone who has joined us today. It is an honor to have you here with us to celebrate such an important milestone for our university, the Georgetown Americas Institute's inaugural year. And it's a great privilege to hear your views on how the countries of the Americas, a part of the world that is so important to all of us, can collaborate to address the critical issues they face. Having you with us is also immensely inspiring for our students. Wonderful examples, as you are, of what can be accomplished with extraordinary commitment, perseverance, integrity, and through working together with and for others. At this time, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers. Ernesto Zedillo served as President of Mexico from 1994 to 2000. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Jackson School of Global Affairs and Frederick Eisen 74 Director of the Program for the Study of Globalization, professor in the fields of economics and political science, and adjunct professor of environmental studies at Yale University. He is a member of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders using their collective experience and influence for peace, justice, and human rights worldwide. In 2000, he was asked to serve on the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, mandated by the World Health Assembly to analyze the COVID-19 pandemic. President Zedillo also currently serves in the Global Commission on Drug Policy and on the selection committee of the Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity and the Hilton Humanitarian Award. He is also a member of the Group of 30, a consultative group on international economic and monetary affairs. Luis Alberto Lacalle Herrera served as President of the Republic of Uruguay from 1990 to 1995 and is a former legislator and senator. President Lacalle Herrera has been recognized for his achievements by the governments of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Spain. He has received honorary degrees from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Complutense University of Madrid, National University of Paraguay, and the Autonomous University of Guadalajara. In June 1993, President Lacalle Herrera was appointed a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George by Queen Elizabeth II of England. And President Lacalle Herrera is a member of the Club de Madrid, Carter Center, and Friends of Israel. Juan Manuel Santos was the President of Colombia from 2010 to 2018. During his time in office, the historic Colombian Peace Agreement was signed on November 24, 2016. President Santos was the sole recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016 for ending the longest armed conflict with the oldest guerrilla force in the Western Hemisphere. Before serving as president, President Santos served as Minister of Foreign Trade and was elected to the Colombian Congress as the presidential designate. He also served as Minister of Finance and Minister of Defense. Prior to serving in government roles, President Santos was a deputy publisher and journalist of the Colombian publication El Tiempo. He won the Knight of Spain Prize for journalism for a series of articles looking at the corruption within the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. President Santos is a graduate of the Naval Academy in Cartagena. He also holds a degree in business and economics from the University of Kansas. Now, I'd like to ask each former president a question so they can share some thoughts and perspectives on the state of affairs in the Americas and the place of the Americas in the larger geopolitical context. I'd like to start with you, Professor Zedillo, President Zedillo. Many have commented that Latin America and the Caribbean once again find themselves facing a set of development traps that inhibit inclusive and sustainable growth. What do you see as the most promising political economic strategies and social policies to help the region address these old and new development challenges?
Well, thank you very much. First, let me express how pleased I am to be back to Georgetown, and on this occasion, particularly because this is part of the activities of a new institution at this great university. And the topic of this institute is the Americas, and particularly Latin America. So I congratulate Georgetown and also express my gratitude for this initiative, and also my confidence that under the leadership of Alejandro, this is going to be a great addition to the academic and scholarly life of this university, and hopefully it will also provide ideas to address the big challenges of our region, of Latin America and the Caribbean. Well, and of course I am so happy to be in the good company of President Lacalle and President Santos, my dear friend. I say hello to you. President Santos and I are regular in various circuits. I just saw him in Bogota and a few days before in London, and now I see you in Washington. Great. Anyways, yes, before I go into the what must be done, I think we need to provide, Diana, a very candid diagnosis of where we are in Latin America. Because otherwise, it will be hard to make the connection between the state of the region and whatever we think is right to do in the region to overcome the present situation. And what we have very shortly expressed, Latin America is actually in the middle of another lost decade. If one pays attention to a very key indicator, which is per capita income, properly measure PPP and whatever you want to do in the methodology. Basically, what we have is that the largest countries in Latin America next year, and some of them even next year, will have lower per capita income than they had in 2014. If allowing a decade to pass and then having exactly the same or lower per capita income is not a lost decade, well, what else can be a lost decade? And this is a confrontation with reality. And the reality is that, again, we Latin Americans must accept that we have failed to have our economies, and I would say our societies, converge towards what we have always thought not only was possible, but we wanted. That is to say, the levels of economic and social and political development of the countries that today are considered developed. And our comparison is not only bad relative to the developed countries, but it's also bad, and in some cases very bad, relative to other areas, other countries in, let's say, emerging and developing countries, which have been able to grow faster and to address more seriously the social challenges that they have had over time. So again, when we speak about Latin America, we have to use the word failure, because what has happened in the last decade is that we went stagnant, and that also the gains that we had made in very important fronts like reducing poverty and improving income distribution, we are not losing again that battle. I must put an asterisk, dear students and faculty members, that, and I was telling that President Lacalle, that there is one country in particular that sort of spoils my generalization about Latin America, and happily is Uruguay. Uruguay has been doing well. Its indicators have continued to improve. Of course, we also have to acknowledge the great progress in Chile, although social progress has been much slower. And also I want to do it, mention Costa Rica. But if you put apart those three countries, unfortunately, my statements apply to the generality or the totality of the Latin American countries. What that means is that, again, we feel like in a trap. You use the term development trap. I like to use another term, which is pre-development trap. I wish we were trapped in development. That would be nice, but we aren't. We seem to be heading that direction, and then we get stuck. And that, I think, is a real trap. And I like to speak of a trap that is constituted of, or formed by three pits, tres pozos. We are in tres pozos, in a big trap, right? The first one is our mediocre growth after the commodity boom. When it was over, suddenly we woke up and realized that after all, we were not taking off as we thought we were. We were basically, and that applies more to the South American countries, riding on the shoulders of China, enjoying a super extended commodity boom that explained a good part of the good growth record of the first 10, 15 years of the present century. So since 2015, very bad growth. I already mentioned the question of per capita income. If we go behind the aggregate figures of growth, what we see as immediate driving explanatory variable of that very mediocre performance has to do with productivity. Productivity growth, average labor productivity, very low relative to what we see in other countries, and what students who study economics know very well, total factor productivity not only not growing, but in fact making every year a negative contribution to GDP growth. That is to say, our economies tend to be inefficient. And of course, the immediate answer is yes, of course, because we have a labor force that is mostly employed, in some countries 50, 60%, in the informal sectors of the economy. Well, that is true. That's almost tautological. I think we have to inquire what drives that informality in our economies. But at the end of the day, we have low growth or negative growth, and we have, along with that growth or driving force, very bad productivity. So that's one bit that we have to address. The other one is poverty and inequality. As I mentioned, we had made significant progress relative to historical standards in the first 15 years of the century. That sort of went still around that time. If you compare 2015 with whatever figures are the most recent, yesterday or a few days ago, the Economic Commission of Latin America released its social panorama for Latin America, and the picture that you get from that is very sad. Poverty has increased by the millions, and poverty rates have increased, and extreme poverty also is increasing in many countries in Latin America. And this, of course, is the human dimension of our failure, but also has consequences on growth, because societies that tend to be so unequal, and with so many people poor because they only can work in the informal sector of the economy, are economies that almost by definition are not going to have satisfactory economic growth. So we have to address that circumstance. And the third bit is a very serious one, and that is the weak rule of law that most of our countries, again, I have to acknowledge the fortunate exception. So this proves that it is not because we are Latin Americans, because these guys are also Latin Americans and can do well, have good rule of law, have very, good income distribution relative to other parts of the world, and so on. But Latin America, a very important feature is that rule of law is much weaker. Again, you can review the indicators. There are many sources, but one I like to take frequently to review the situation is the index produced by the World Justice Project, and it's terribly embarrassing to find there that out of Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, there are, let's say, among the 35 or 40 countries, the top of the list, then you start finding, the Argentinas, the Brazils, and very down below, the Mexicos of this world. That is to say, not only that, but also that since it's been several years since the index has been published, you can see a deterioration year after year in rule of law. And that implies not only protection of property rights, but in general, citizen security. All the important aspects of rule of law are weak in Latin America, weak and weakening. That is a tragedy. If one projects to the future, I don't know what is going to happen. So these are the three bits in this pre-development trap. Unfortunately, and only recently, I am beginning to be concerned another possible sub-trap, and that is democracy. What we have seen in recent years in many countries in Latin America is not only the stagnation of democratic progress, but actually what we are seeing is a democratic regression. Animated, promoted, being done by populist governments, which is totally ironic, because here we have leaders who have been elected through the democracies that over many years we were able to build. Thanks to that, they had access to power according to the rules. And once they are in power, the first thing that they like to do is to start undermining democracy, weakening the institutions that allow them in the first place to compete and to win power. And this seems to be a very, assiduous and unfortunately, in some cases, very efficient work that they are doing. So, and that will be terrible, because here we are at this moment, when this institute is being created, saying, it's not a good time for Latin America, but we have two complications on top of that. We are going to have a very challenging external environment. We may be on the eve of global stagflation, right? Caused by many reasons. But also, we have a situation in which many of our countries are going back to the past, to authoritarian, autocratic, despotic governments that don't believe in the rule of law, that don't believe in institutions, and that, by the way, practice politics of exclusion, of division, of alienating our societies, groups within our societies, one against the other. One expression of this situation, unfortunately, has been the performance of many of our countries, again, with an admirable exception of Uruguay during the pandemic. Shamefully, out of the 10 worst countries in the pandemic, before vaccination was possible, 6 out of 10 were Latin American countries. The 6 Latin American countries, including Chile, by the way, were terrible performers during the pandemic. And this, I think, speaks a lot of where we are and how challenged we are in this moment. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do at these sub-traps. I think if you start talking only about them, which has been a tradition, let's talk only about growth, then you immediately, and what needs to be done, and we know in theory what needs to be done to have faster productivity growth and GDP, immediately you hit political economy constraints, the politics of it. You want to fix poverty and income distribution? Well, again, you hit the constraint of resources, but also you hit the constraint of the politics of it. And again, if you want to reform your rule of law and security institutions, by itself, it will be very difficult. So what I suggest is that perhaps we have to look holistically at these 3 pits and perhaps appreciate that there are some trade-offs so that it is possible to pose a deal among the different constituencies that will oppose the necessary reforms. Some people are interested in rule of law and security, but they don't want to pay taxes to have improved judiciary or whatever, and security. Other people, don't want to preserve their privileges as members of a powerful union, and actually that means that they defend so much those rights that don't allow others to have the same rights. So what did we try to have? Universal rights, like universal access for healthcare, like a universal pension, right? And by the way, you need a tax reform, which is opposed by some, but will be supported by this. So we could construct all of these deals among different sectors and groups of societies, and then, in my view, it will be possible to depict, at least, and try to implement a great political agreement that will allow us to address the 3 pits. So that's my point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And does a wonderful job of setting the stage for everything that we'll talk about over the next time. President Lacalle Herrera, a little bit, we're going to turn now the situation inside out to look at Latin America on the global stage. So in the current complicated political context, with increasing tensions between the US and China and a war in Europe, what role or roles do you think the Americas, or particular countries of the Americas, can and should play on the global stage? What do you see as the most important challenges and opportunities for the hemisphere?
In the first place, thank you for the invitation. You may not believe me, but the last time I was here, I was an aspiring politician 54 years ago. Well, I'm 81, so you make your calculations. In the second place, after hearing President Cedillo, of course, we will want to move to Uruguay. So here we have the ambassador, the people from the embassy. You can begin all the papers this same evening. In the third place, I will, whenever you want, it will take me only 1 hour to try to explain to everyone that there is no one Latin America. I've been fighting for this for the last 50 years. It's very easy for, even for the academy and even for professors, of course for politicians, of course for journalists, to use the label Latin America and then turn away without going deeper. And of course, you think for a moment, when you hear the words Latin America, you think about Mexico, the Caribbean, perhaps north of Colombia and Venezuela, Cuba, of course, the islands, the Antilles, and not much more. And sometimes I try to joke with my American friends and even European friends. You see, the earth is round, so when you look from Florida, you can see up to the equator, but the rest of us, we are in the other side. So nobody knows we exist. And if Diana accepts me one other day, I will take you in a general view of the 4 Latin Americas that I think can be different. And even the approach then to this answer would be different in the first Latin America, the one I mentioned just now, the Pacific, which is another reality, excuse me, the River Plate Basin, which means Uruguay, Paraguay, east of Bolivia, Argentina, even south of Brazil, and even Brazil, which is a continent by itself. So it's very difficult to apply a single formula to the type of relationships we must and could have. For instance, now through the advance of Iran, China, Russia in the first Latin America, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, of course, they are in the big game of the great powers, because China and Russia are moving the chess, their pieces in the chessboard, and they will have bases in the Caribbean Sea. They will have their navies coming over. They have very important treaties with Iran and China and Russia. So the answer of what is the future, which is the future for that region, is of a very great emergency. If you read about and realize that Venezuela has been colonized by Cuba, that the intervention of Cuba in the government of Venezuela, the government, not just friends, allies, no, in the government, introducing themselves into the intelligence service, customs, security, media, you realize there is a storm forming there, and the Iranians are taking in account that and have a special relationship, even an airline that comes Tehran, Caracas directly. And puts that Latin America in the eye of the storm. Perhaps, of course, Ukraine is taking the minutes of the TV and the articles of the journalists, but at the same time, there is another tension that is very important. On the other side, the rest of Latin America. Of course, we have with China the very important commercial relationship. And if you look from the practical point of view, Lord Palmerston in England famously said that Britain didn't have permanent friends or permanent allies, just permanent interests. And that was the wisdom of Great Britain, and it was one of the most important and longest living empires. We, the small countries, must have the same position. We have interests. And if China buys 40% of the produce of Uruguay, and then comes very well-intentioned American diplomats and say, well, Uruguay, rule of law, good. Separation of power, good. Freedom of press, good. Democracy functioning, opposition, well, everything that Mr. Cedillo explained much better than I can. And then when Uruguay says, well, what about business and trade? So, from the point of view of certain countries, China is, of course, much more ingrained into Argentina, which is a very important problem for the future. But when we have China and the United States, I wrote a very small booklet 5 years ago called Latin America Between Trump and China. And I tried to explain that we were in a conundrum. We belong to the West, we belong to the Occidente, we belong to the Judeo-Christian civilization, the same values. Of course, we belong to that part of the history of the world. But when chips come down, when chips are down, where's the beef? Where is the reality of the possibility of our economy? So it's not very easy to answer the question, because if we take the side of the values, of course, we are with the United States, with the European Union and the Christian civilization. On the other side, the reality of trade and prosperity comes from the relationship with China. So the question must be answered in that not vague, but very realistic way. We don't want to be following any center of power. We have coincidence of values with one, and we will have interest, commercial interest with the other. The four Latin Americas perhaps have another kind of links with the reality. But I will mention something that President Cedillo said here. It's very interesting what he said about the governments that were legally elected. We must always have in mind that democracy has two kinds of legitimacy. Legitimacy of origin, which means fair elections, and legitimacy of government. Because governments must be legitimate in their origin, but rule legitimately. We have the state, the rule of law makes the job of president very, very much constrained to certain formulas and respecting of the law. When you have the two legitimacy, you can speak, we can mention a real democracy. And it's very true that they come through the ballot, and the first thing they do is, well, one term is too little. Let's have 2 or 3 or 4 or for good. Then they say, well, you know, the press is getting a bit noisy. They are very unfair towards us. They gag the press. Then, and that slowly is the history of Venezuela and the history of other countries. And it's very important for what President Zedillo said, legitimacy of origin, but legitimacy of exercise of power, which is the other thing we must take into account. It makes it much more difficult. Our jobs were much difficult than Mr. Maduro's job, but we prefer our way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. President. And now, President Santos, and this is a question that sort of underlies what both President Zedillo and President Lacalle Herrera have spoken about. Observers have suggested that some countries in the Americas are again experiencing a crisis of governance. If you agree, what do you see as the main dimensions of that crisis? And what particular policies on which the countries of the hemisphere might coordinate do you think might help to address these domestic governance crises?
First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very sorry not to be there in person, but I'm very glad to be on the company of President Zedillo and President Lacalle. I want to thank Alejandro Werner for this invitation and also thank him for the help that he gave my country and my government when he was at the IMF, which was absolutely fundamental for us improving the welfare of our country. Governance, and I was asked to speak about governance in general, but particularly about the impact on the war on drugs on the governance in Latin America. The governance in general, we are suffering from what almost all democracies are suffering. A very deep and critical polarization, which makes democracies much more ineffective. When people start to discuss with ideological stances and disagree to even make the most fundamental agreements, then democracies will not solve the problems of the people. And we are suffering a crisis of polarization as almost all democracies around the world. This has been exacerbated, of course, by the social consequences of the pandemic. Right now, you see in Latin America, as President Zedillo very well explained, that poverty and inequalities particularly had come backwards instead of forward in the last years. And that also affects the legitimacy of the governments and the governance of each country. So we are suffering the same disease that most democracies are suffering around the world, in the US, in Spain, in the UK, in Eastern Europe. Wherever democracies are present, they are on the defensive, not on the offensive. But there is one aspect which is exacerbating the situation in Latin America, which is the war on drugs. I like to start this explanation with an anecdote, which was back in the 1920s during Prohibition. Winston Churchill took a train and crossed the whole of Canada and arrived in California during Prohibition. And he asked for a whiskey. And they told him, Mr. Churchill, this is prohibited here. We cannot give you a whiskey. And so he said, what a strange country this is, referring to the United States. These fabulous profits that you make out of the sale of liquor you give them to the mafias. In my country, we give it to the treasury. I like to tell this anecdote because, in a way, it summarizes a very severe problem we have in Latin America right now. We go back to the first convention on drugs, 1961, in the discussion of what drugs were prohibited and what drugs were not prohibited. Liquor and tobacco were included in the permissible drugs, but marijuana and the coca leaf, at that time, cocaine did not exist. Coca leaf were put in the prohibited list. 10 years later, President Nixon declared the World War on drugs. Most of you remember those words. And from then onwards, my country, Colombia, has probably been the country that has suffered the most of any country in this war on drugs. We started back in 1967, 68, exporting marijuana. The legend goes that it was a Swedish ship with American soldiers that went to the Caribbean coast and they bought some marijuana from Colombia and they exported it to the United States. They took it because it was so cheap. And then this is an area where contraband is very, very common, and we started to export marijuana, and then our entrepreneurs from another region in Colombia, from the central region, the coffee region, discovered that the United States liked cocaine that was being produced in Peru and Bolivia, and so they started to produce it in Colombia, first importing the raw material from Bolivia and Peru, and then producing it in Colombia. Well, we then started to suffer the consequences of prohibition. And we made a series of agreements among many countries, particularly with the US. I remember President Clinton going to Colombia. I was Minister of Finance at that time, 1992, to launch Plan Colombia. We were having very, very serious problem of governance. We had guerrillas. We had drug traffickers that had grown to acquire tremendous power. We continue to fight the war as the world and especially the US had established, trying to eradicate the coca plantations, the marijuana plantations, try to seize the drugs that were exported, go after the drug cartels, and we demanded from the consuming countries to lower consumption at that end. Well, Colombia lost our best journalists, our best judges, our best political leaders, our best policemen in this war. And I personally had the responsibility of fighting this war when I was Minister of Defense. And I did it with the discipline, spraying more hectares of coca plantations than any other leader in the world, eradicating more coca hectares and marijuana hectares than any other leader in the world. I extradited more drug traffickers to the US than any other leader, 1,453 drug traffickers that I signed the extradition for the United States, seized the largest amount of coca and marijuana in the Colombian fight against drugs. And yet, at the end, we still were the first provider of drugs, especially cocaine, to the world markets. And I said, this is like going in a static bicycle, looking to the right, looking to the left, pedaling very hard, but you don't improve, you don't advance. And I was then convinced that we needed to have a different approach than the one of punitive, prohibitive approach that had been established 40 years before. And that's when, in the Summit of the Americas, I proposed to President Obama, when in Cartagena in the year 2012, why don't we discuss another strategy in this war on drugs, which is not only affecting Colombia, it's starting to affect all the countries in Latin America. And he said yes. I think that he said, I said that in my campaign, let's start the discussion. And we started the discussion, and the OAS in the year 2013 approved a unanimous resolution asking for a special session of the United Nations to discuss this issue, a new approach, more with from the human rights and the health point of view, instead of purely criminal, punitive approach. We went to discuss in this special session. Unfortunately, we met the tremendous opposition of the Asian countries, China, Russia, the Middle Eastern countries. They did not want to hear about any change to the conventions. And in that special session of the United Nations, we advanced very little. We were able to introduce some new concepts, but very, very marginal. Well, in the meantime, the drug cartels, we dismantled the biggest drug cartels in the world that were presented in the newspapers and magazines as unbeatable, the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel. We were able to dismantle those cartels. But as soon as those were dismantled, they were replaced by other smaller cartels. And the business started to expand and expand. We tried to fight the drug traffickers in Colombia, but then we had to go to Central America, and we had to go to Mexico, and the police, the Colombian police, which were quite good in fighting the drug traffickers, went to these countries and saw how these countries were being taken over by the drug cartels. And this is what has happened in the last years. The prohibition has stimulated the organized crime to the extent that I believe that today, from Mexico to Argentina, you go Central America, look at Haiti, the problem in Haiti basically has to do with the drug traffic. But you go to Ecuador right now, you ask the president, which is your biggest headache? Drug traffickers. Venezuela, and you go down, Brazil. I was in Sao Paulo a few months ago, and both the mayor and the governor said, we don't know what to do with organized crime and the territory that they're starting to control. And so what I think is that today, probably one of the most serious challenges that we have is the fight against drugs and how we are losing this fight. We are losing this fight that was declared 60 years ago, and that today we are not better off than when we were worse off. And that's why in Colombia, we think that it's time to really make a dramatic change in this war on drugs. And not only Colombia, President Cedillo and I, we are part of the Global Commission on Drug Policy that has been trying to stimulate this discussion and a change in the approach against the war against the drug trafficking for many years. But at the same time, with the peace agreement, the Truth Commission in Colombia, that made a marvelous work in a relatively short amount of time, came to the conclusion that all the violence that Colombia has had in the last 50, 60 years, the almost 1 million people dead, 9 million displaced, all of them in one way or another had to do with drug trafficking, and particularly with the profits that are made out of the sale of drugs, out of this business, this prohibited business. So they recommended that Colombia should start to regulate the drug trafficking. All drugs, not only marijuana, cocaine and opium. The Global Commission on Drugs made a study about Colombia, and more or less at the same time, 2 weeks ago, President Cedillo was in Bogota presenting the report on Colombia with the former president of Switzerland, saying exactly the same thing. And I think that right now, all of Latin America should get together and discuss this and make a proposal to the rest of the world, sort of relaunch what was initiated back in the year 2016, because we have new actors. Africa is suffering the same problem that Latin America. Most of the countries in Africa are being taken over by organized crime whose basic business is drug trafficking. They diversify into illegal mining and to extortion, and but they control a lot of territory in Africa and especially Latin America. There are places in Mexico, President Cedillo knows this much better than I do, places in Colombia and most of Latin American countries where the state does not control the territory. So this is a big, big problem that we have to address by being more pragmatic, by regulating the drugs and taking away the money from organized crime, as the United States did during Prohibition. And I would end by saying another anecdote, by telling you another anecdote, also during Prohibition. It was when Al Capone had Chicago almost completely controlled. And there was a discussion about Prohibition. And the chairman of the Chicago Criminal Commission said, he was the head of the war against crime, said, we will never do away completely with organized crime, but we can really diminish it and weaken it if we do away with prohibition. And I think this is something that all of Latin America must discuss, and collectively, because many countries are afraid of doing it individually because they would be considered pariahs because they are breaking the conventions in the UN, but collectively to address this problem that is having a tremendous effect in the governance of Latin America through corruption, through Many of the drug traffickers have tremendous political influence. They are buying elections, they are buying the political power, and that is increasing everywhere. And that's something we must address with determination and with conviction. Thank you.
Thank you, President Santos. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for those thoughts, and I hope your visions come to reality. What we'd like to do now is, as the students and others were waiting in the hallway to join us in the auditorium, we collected some questions from them, some of them to all of you and some of them to one or more of you. So what I'd like to do now is just pose a few questions from the students, a few things that they would like to know about you or your countries or your ideas for the future. So we'll go again in the same order. I'll ask President Zedillo a question, and then President Lacalle Herrera, and then President Santos. So the first question for you, President Zedillo. And this is from Jessica Castillo, who is a student in the Masters of Latin American Studies program. She says, given the recent Los Angeles Declaration and other efforts in the region to tackle migration, where do you see further opportunities and challenges in tackling migration in Latin America?
Well, I don't think the LA Declaration was terribly enlightened or ambitious. It didn't contain any principles to address this issue. I have a rather pessimistic view, and that is compounded by the economic perspectives that Latin Americans have. Because I would say that the push factors for migration are not going to improve, and most likely will keep increasing if we don't have faster growth, if we don't have better social policies and results, and if rule of law continues to weaken in our countries. So that's on the push factors. On the pull factors, or countries receiving migrants, I don't see any political conditions at this moment to see enlightened policies. Certainly that is not the case of the United States. If ever there was a process towards consensus of having more rational policies, that trend disappeared many years ago. So now there seems to be a competition among American politicians to see who is more anti-migration, actually anti-trade, anti-globalization. And that I think is very unfortunate. First and foremost, because I think it's against the interest of the United States, the country that has played an enormous leading role in building a world of rules and interdependence, and that has benefited a lot from the international movement of factors of production and from international trade. And here we are in the second decade, third decade of the 21st century, the very same United States questioning that approach. So I would say right now I don't see any perspective. I think we should say we are on our own, and we have to address the issues that make our people willing to migrate to the United States or to other parts of the world. I think there is no lack of ideas of how the issue should be handled. I myself have been part of several intellectual endeavors in that respect. I chair at least a couple of commissions that studied and made specific proposals, some of them based here in Washington, International Migration Institute. And yet, if you ask me, do you see any, at this moment, any political opportunity? Here, I would say, no, I don't see any political opportunity. So let's work in other things that perhaps there is more political opportunity, like the issue that President Santos presented so clearly before.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question is for President Lacalle Herrera, and this is from Renee Brady, who is a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. And she would like to know, how can the countries of the Americas work together to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Climate change.
The effects of climate change. So how are the countries of the Americas feeling the effects of climate change, and how might they work together to mitigate those effects?
Well, as you know, the climate problem is not a local problem, it's a worldwide problem. And of course, after all these conferences now in Sharm el-Sheikh or whatever it is in Egypt, there are certain goals of 1.5 centigrade for the year 30 and so on. I feel it's a bit of an esoteric conversation, because from one point of view, many European countries criticize Brazil because of the Amazonia forest. Before that, they cut all their forests all over Europe, which was covered by trees. So now they use accept the excuse of Amazonian deforesting for not signing the trade accord between Mercosur and Europe. So sometimes, and it's not the only case, the green policies and the problems of the environment are very much used for local or for international policies. Each country must do what each country can. For instance, once again, Uruguay has 98% of the energy generation of sustainable generation. It's hydroelectric, it's solar, and it's wind. Only 2% is with fuels, so we do our part. At the same time, you know that cattle have been signaled as responsible of methane thrown into the atmosphere. Each country must do what it can, but of course, there's no global government, and the interests of fossil fuels are very important. The coal lobby also. Some countries like Colombia has a very important coal. Carbon is in Spanish, coal. Coal mines and coal-generated electricity. So there's one Colombian interest which I must respect. We don't have that problem, but you know, the Americas or the Latin Americas must do each what it can, because political power is limited to the territory. Of course, we have trade pacts have an environmental sentence now always, and if we are the co-owners of the River Plate or the rivers that separate us of the frontier with Brazil, we must have common policies. But we only can do what we can. At the same time, it's very difficult for a government official, a president, or a member of the cabinet, when they put in one side the need of work and development, and the other the care of the forests and the animals and the air and the water, which are very important both. One is urgent, the other is also urgent, but can be, in a period of government, you can show it to the next government. So we are doing what we can, and each country must allow to be recorded as what it's doing now. Not all the Americas can have the same rules or the same decisions. We are doing what we can. Sorry, not very conclusive answer, I said.
These are difficult questions the students are posing. Another question for President Santos, and this is from Edward Sun, who's a student graduating in 2026 in the School of Foreign Service. How has Latin America adapted to new interests and investment from China and other world powers? Some have praised these investments, while others have called them predatory. What is your opinion?
Thank you. I would like to very shortly address the previous question about biodiversity, because I think we have an opportunity there. Latin America, we are blessed with the richest biodiversity in the whole planet. And for example, there is the summit of how to protect biodiversity that is going to take place in Montreal next month. Latin America should try to present its case with one voice and present its case in order to demand from the industrialized countries, from the richest countries, more commitment and more financial commitment. Now that President Lacalle mentioned, for example, the coal in Colombia. Colombia is the biggest exporter of coal in Latin America. And what we can do is that in Glasgow, South Africa was able to obtain $8.5 billion to phase out its production of coal. In Indonesia, in Egypt, Indonesia was able to get $20 billion to phase out its production of coal. In Colombia, we don't have a big coal generators for our own consumption. We export it. 73% of our electricity comes from hydro. So we could very well phase out the coal, but we should be compensated. And collectively, we can do many things as a region because of the natural resources that we have. Now, going to the question about China. As President Lacalle said, every country has its own interest and should defend its own well-being. In the case of Colombia, the presence of China has been very limited. We did not need the financing that China offered other countries, and other countries took this lollipop that was presented in order to be able to do investments in infrastructure and in other areas. I think that we have assimilated the Chinese presence rather well. It's not a presence as big and as important as it is in Africa, for example, or some Asian countries. And we should be pragmatic. Don't get scared because China wants to invest in our countries. That's welcome. Compete with the US, compete with Europe. We benefit from that competition. But we must be very careful of how this investment is made and the conditions that are put in this type of investments. But the Chinese presence in Latin America, I think, should be welcomed because it's something we need. That type of investment. We need the technology that China can bring, and if it's a logical and profitable investment, welcome. I don't think that for political reasons we should be sort of worry or forbid the Chinese investment in our countries.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll have another round of questions, one again for each of you, since we have the time. The next question is from Maria Carmen Baron Esper, who is a student in the McCourt School of Public Policy, and this is a question for President Zedillo. It's a little bit of an extensive question, but I'd like to do it justice, so I'll read the whole thing.
Is it written so that I can? My memory is very short.
It is written, but I need the card to read it. With the ample context and experience you have dealing as president with a financial crisis, a democratic transition, and a new trade agreement, and considering Mexico's increase in education levels, natural resources, and access to the international market, here comes the question, what would you say is missing to bridge the inequality gap, increase decent jobs, and bring out Mexico's potential for economic prosperity, specifically to the most vulnerable?
Well, let me start by inquiring a little bit farther into this question. It may suggest something that I have heard before, say, okay, Mexico was a good student, quote. They did all these things that are listed in that paragraph, and yet the record in terms of growth and also of improvement in social indicators is not satisfactory. And the next step is some people who have gained, by the way, political power in Mexico and other places, saying, you see, those reforms were not useful. That's why we have to go back to the 1960s or 70s or even worse. That is to say, reforms were no good. I would say, no, we haven't accomplished what we wanted, thinking about the second half of the 1990s, because the process of reform was never completed. You cannot do all the reforms that you need in Latin America in just a few years. I would say that the profound causes of insatisfaction that we have today should not be addressed or referred to the reforms that were undertaken, but rather to the fact that the reforms were stopped on its toes. If you review exactly what has happened over the last 20 years, you know, they say, where are the reforms? Very few in Latin America. As I said before, we're riding on the shoulders of the commodity boom. And by the way, we have to be very careful, because when the Latin America have its best social improvements, practically in its history, in the first 10, 15 years of this century. You will never find in our long history the reduction in poverty, the improvement in income distribution that took place in the majority of our countries, including my own country. So establishing a functional relationship between the reforms undertaken in the last part of the 20th century and the present degree of, of insatisfaction, I think it's a mistake. I think you have to say, if you are analytically rigorous, say, wait a minute, where is the additional labor flexibility that you were supposed to implement? Where are the barriers to entry and to exit for firms? Where are the improvements in the tribunals to protect property rights and to solve controversies? Where are the additional investments in education? Where is the additional opening? I mean, Mercosur has been stalled now since its creation. It continues to be, a fortress, not the open idea that was built upon. So I think there are many things that have not been done and that are associated very wrongly to the reforms. Of course, to have better social improvement, you need to have faster growth, faster productivity, and you have to have directed, efficient social policies, not only general policies on education and on health, but also to address directly the problem of poverty. And look what is happening in some countries. Not only the policies, but the institutions in charge of carrying out those policies in a transparent and accountable way are being destroyed. Because we are going back to the years of clientelism that I will give you if you vote for me. You will have my support, but you have to come to the next demonstration of support to the government. I mean, we know that very well in Mexico because we practice it for a long time, and we are now seeing a renaissance of the old ways. And I think that's ultimately an attack, a frontal attack on the Mexican democracy.
Wonderful, thank you. This next question is perhaps a little bit related to the last things that President Zedillo was saying. Given Brazil's recent election and its significance in Latin America, what do you think Lula's return to the presidency means for the region? What do you think Lula's return to the presidency in Brazil means for Latin America?
Well, I tend to distinguish, once again, between the generalization of journalists, even in academia or politicians. There is a leftist wave in Latin America. Well, perhaps it's correctly named because they tend to come from certain way of looking at policies or even philosophically. But it's not the same what happened in Colombia or what happened in Peru or what happened in Chile. And Lula is not to be put into that kind of temor, how to say, fright. Oh, they were very frightened with Lula coming over. I don't think he will be a radical president. Why? Because first, Brazil is a different country altogether from our kind of Spanish-born countries. It's Portuguese-born. It's a very different way of doing politics. There's no right angles in Brazilian policy. They tend to accommodate, which is a wisdom. It's a very important wisdom from the point of view of a country. Remember that Brazil didn't have any war of independence. One day, Juan VI, John VI, decided to go back to Europe, and Peter I said, "Eu fico, I stay." And he stayed, and his father went to Portugal. But of course, you can laugh at this, but it's very important in the sense of the sociological way of doing things in Brazil. So, that being said, Lula comes for a second chance, which it's not very usual to have in politics, especially many years separation from one president or the other. He comes from jail to the presidency. He's almost 80, he's 70-something. It's his last chance. And I think he will be very wise, as Brazil is politically very wise. Perhaps he will pay lip service to, now he's wanting to have once again UNASUR, which was organized against Mexico from the point of view of Brazil. They have this tug of war, no? You know, Mexico and Brazil. If you know, you must realize, you know it. Yeah. But I'm sure Lula will pay lip service to that kind of, Maduro, how he's nice or whatever. But when chips are down in the policy, he will be a very moderate government. It's not wishful thinking. It's a bit of wishful thinking because remember that we are that small wedge of land between Argentina and Brazil. we are the size of Oklahoma. And we have these big neighbors. So we prefer the neighbors to be very happy, wise, and not very much interested in our affairs. But I do think that Lula won't be the cuckoo, the horrible thing that will happen to Latin America. It's much worse on the other side. In Argentina, it's much bigger problem in the future because it's, I want to be very respectful, but it's difficult to find a way out of the Argentine situation. But I don't think Lula will be, I can be wrong, of course, as always, but I want to say something about Latin America because I'm sorry to put this subject. We must take into account that in Latin America, the most important man in last century was Fidel Castro. Like it or not, he was the man that was the primus movens of many historical currents, subversion, guerrillas, war, subversive war in every country, even in mine, which was one of the steadiest democracy. But one day, the gentleman, at the end of his life, realized that the guerrilla movement and the armed movements were out of his plans, and he invented El Foro de San Pablo, which you must study because it's an acting force, evil force in Latin America. The Foro de San Pablo was when the idea was Fidel's. He said, well, let's go back to the old bourgeois thing of elections. And he invited Lula, which was one of the first to move in that sense, and Chavez, and both they were the inventors of Foro de San Pablo. Go into the networks and you'll see what Foro de San Pablo wants to do. It's very clear. They are there to promote every division in every society. Gender problems, Indian problems, unions against everything that's a conflict that will push and put a wedge into to widen it. That's what's happened in Chile. There was a strike because of the price of the subway. It was a pacific manifestation of many thousands of people. It is a democratic country. But as soon as the sun set, a couple of hundreds of activists went on rampage, breaking the shields of the cars and on the stores, and it became una terrible manifestación. The same thing in Colombia. That's the Foro de San Pablo, which is an evil force working against the destabilization of democracy. If you want one proof, where is the only country that they are acting now? In Ecuador, which doesn't fit into the general leftist camp. So take that in account and study the Foro de San Pablo, which is a very negative force. I'm sorry for this intervention.
No, please, thank you. And I think our last question will be for President Santos. This is a little off the political track, but I think a critical question. Given recent threats to cybersecurity around the world, how do you see the countries of the Americas adapting in this new digital age, and in particular to cybersecurity threats?
Well, I think we are learning to adapt to this very fast technological change that we have all experienced in the last years, and that nobody has the perfect formula or even the adequate regulation. Usually what happens is that technology is way ahead of the capacity of governments to regulate the technology. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad. We are seeing different expressions of the inconvenience of not regulating technology or the lack of capacity of regulating technology. We saw it in my country some weeks ago. I think Mexico also, a hacker that came into the police and to the judicial system and started to publish all kinds of security data that made things very difficult for many countries. That type of attacks, well, we should have more cooperation. I think the U.S. can play a very important role there because the U.S. has much more knowledge and the capacity to help the Latin American countries to administer this type of situation. We are living in general in very uncertain times, and in terms of technology, this uncertainty is multiplied because we really don't know in what direction this is going to go. What is the effect of artificial intelligence in warfare, for example? What is the effect of the cyber attacks on the companies or the media? We still are exploring and trying to digest what is happening in this area, and I think that what we should cooperate more to see how we can regulate it and how we can cope with this technology change for the future. But it's a difficult question, and forgive me for just mentioning something about Lula. I hope that Lula could exercise some leadership in the region, because one of the very difficult problems that we have had in Latin America in the last years is a total lack of leadership. Wherever Latin America is present, nobody speaks. In the G20, we were talking with President Cedillo. Latin America should have said something. The Latin American countries that are Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, they said nothing. In the different forums, Latin America is very absent. So I hope that Lula, that because of the size of Brazil and his experience, that he could exercise some kind of leadership in the very difficult geopolitical world we are living in.
Thank you, President Santos. So I'd like to extend my greatest thanks to President Zedillo, to President Lacalle, to President Santos for being with us here today and for sharing these very important thoughts with the underlying themes of coordination and cooperation among the countries of the region and the very critical question of leadership in the region. It has been an absolute honor and a pleasure to speak with you today. Please join me in thanking our President.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this special gathering to celebrate the inaugural year of the Georgetown Americas Institute, a new effort in our community to deepen and expand opportunities for dialogue, research, teaching, and engagement in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. This institute represents the long-standing engagement of our community in Latin America and the leadership and generosity of Rolando and Monica Gonzalez-Bunster, who through their generous gift have helped us to realize even greater possibilities for our university to pursue research, engagement, and impact on key issues facing our region. Rolando and Monica. Rolando and Monica, it is an honor to have you and your family here this afternoon as we witness this incredible moment in the life of our university community. From our earliest days as a community, we had a special connection across the Americas. Some of our earliest students called Latin America home. Our earliest course catalogs were printed in English, Spanish, and French. And over the years, we've been honored to welcome thousands of students from Latin America and to contribute to the education of so many leaders in the region. Our academic programs have provided opportunities for engagement, dialogue, teaching, and research across our campuses. More than 60 years ago, we laid the foundations of our Center for Latin American Studies at our School of Foreign Service. At our Law Center, we have our Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. At Georgetown College, the Americas Forum in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and in our business school, the Latin American Leadership Program. And our Latin American board, comprised of leaders from the region, has played a vital role in building relationships, partnerships, and initiatives for our university in Latin America. We are deeply grateful to so many colleagues who have helped us to build, sustain, and deepen our commitment to this region over these many years. The vision for this institute is drawn from these strengths. Under the leadership of founding director Alejandro Werner and managing director Denise Yanovich, the institute has established 4 interdisciplinary areas of focus: governance and the rule of law, economic growth and innovation, social and cultural inclusion, and sustainability in the environment. Already, the Institute has created an interview series, grant programs to support faculty research, collaboration and student engagement, and a Student Fellows program. And I'd like to thank our Institute staff, the Institute's faculty committee, its advisors for their work to guide this new endeavor. We look forward to the contributions of this new institute, the collaborations and partnerships it will foster, the research and engagement it will pursue, and the impact it will have on addressing key issues across the Americas. Now, to celebrate the Georgetown Americas Institute, we could think of no better way than to engage key leaders from across the region to provide their reflections on the challenges and opportunities facing the Americas. Earlier, we heard from a panel of 3 heads of state: former President of Uruguay, Luis Alberto Lacalle Herrera, former President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, and former President of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo. We will now hear from President Bill Clinton, President of the United States, who will be joining us to offer brief reflections on Zoom. The Clinton administration was responsible in 1994 for hosting the first Summit of the Americas, which brought together 34 heads of state from our hemisphere in dialogue on issues of mutual concern, sustainable development, shared prosperity, democratic ideals. So please join me in welcoming President Clinton.
Thank you very much. First of all, President DeJoy, I want to apologize to all of you. I was supposed to be in one of those empty chairs you're looking at now, doing an interview with Milan Vivir. But I tested positive for COVID a few days ago, and I was still positive today. And I thought, in the spirit of cooperation, it would be better if I didn't come to my alma mater and infect half the people I came into conflict with. So I have been preaching the virtues of restraint and getting vaccinated and taking the boosters. And I'm trying to practice what I preach, but I very much regret not being there because I've looked forward to this. Many of you there know that Rolando and Monica Gonzalez-Boonster are 2 of my closest friends, and I have been thrilled by the new life that has been breathed into Georgetown's capacity to educate people and bring them together from our region, thanks to them. And I wish I could be with you, but I do want to say this is a very good thing. I'm also quite well aware that I'm the last thing on the program before dinner, so I should be as brief as possible. I think there are a few things worth thinking about. First of all, when I was president, I gave an unprecedented amount of attention to the Americas. It was highlighted, as President DeJoy said, by the first Summit of the Americas, also by the emergency loan I arranged for Mexico when it was facing insolvency. And I knew President Zedillo was a good, competent, and corruption-free leader who would do a good job. And if we didn't do this, it would be a terrible mistake. At the time, America was in one of its periodic inward-looking phrases, and there was a poll in the morning paper that said something like 80% of the people were against my doing this. And it took me about 90 seconds to make the decision to try to help Mexico, because I knew that first, it would stabilize their economy. It would strengthen their ability to produce and to buy. It would reduce the amount of undocumented immigration and help them to help us reduce the amount of narcotic trafficking. Anyway, all of that. And as everyone knows now, Mexico paid that loan back 3 years early, and we made more than $500 million more, which used to be real money back in the 1990s. We made more than $500 million more in interest than we would have had we simply invested the money in US government bonds. And I think that became a symbol for what we ought to be trying to do together all over the Americas. I brought all the countries in the Caribbean together twice, and we did many things together. And we had the Caribbean Trade Initiative, which enabled a lot of duty-free goods to come into the United States. I got a lot of criticism for NAFTA, but perhaps not so much anymore as people consider the alternative. If the United States imports something made in China, on average, the product will have 4% American-made components. If we import it from Mexico, it's about 40%. According to Mike McLarty, who was my first chief of staff in the White House and then became my first envoy to the Americans, and who may be in the audience tonight. I don't know if he's there or not, but he did a brilliant job in normalizing in great detail in many places our relationships. All these things should be studied, because we have got to figure out a way to build a world where we work together. And for people in the United States and students coming here to go to school at Georgetown, they need to understand that in political life, you should always be working for the best and being prepared for something less than the best. And anybody thinking about America's relationship with other nations would say working for the best means building as many relationships as possible that would give us inclusive economics, inclusive societies, and inclusive political cooperation. And preparing for the worst means that if everything else goes off the rails, we need to be good neighbors. Because if we're good neighbors, other people will know it and we will work together. I see President Santos here, and he knows how long that we worked together. I worked as president and later with 3 different presidents of Colombia who were all committed to Plan Colombia and to making it work. And I tried to support President Duque too, and he had a bad head to play because of COVID and the upheavals in Venezuela. But I don't think America did enough to help Colombia during that period. I realized there were other problems and we were thinking about other things, but we need to know that what goes on in the second oldest democracy in the Americas is profoundly important. And I want to thank you, President Santos, for the efforts you have made and continue to make on that front. I think it's worth noting that the United States, it's not all give and no take with us. We got a lot to learn. There was politics in Colombia and in Brazil were deeply divided. In Colombia, the first leftist government the country has elected, at least in modern terms, was elected, and there was a peaceful transition, and no one questioned the election outcome. And they had none of the sort of misbehavior that we've seen in the United States. Why did that happen? The current president of Colombia, who was himself once involved 30 years ago plus in a guerrilla movement, I met when he was mayor of Bogota, proudly showing me his all-electric vehicle 9 years ago, before most people in America thought about whether we could have a big fleet of electric cars. In Brazil, I was frankly glad President Lula won, because under his watch, he reduced deforestation in the Amazon, and he also saw economic growth. So I thought that his successor was in error in encouraging people to go ahead and rip up the Amazon and let their grandchildren worry about it. And I think we got a new chance to work together with Brazil to bring the Americas together and make it stronger. I think every time we've had a chance to learn from each other and work together and passed it, we paid for it. I've always been grateful to Argentina for being such a good partner with America, no matter which party was in our White House. And I tried to convince the government that succeeded mine in the United States not to let Argentina go off the rails when it was in a deep recession in the early 2000s. I gave it my best shot and I failed. But I think now any reasonable person looking back would say that was a mistake, because Argentina entered a long period of economic and political uncertainty, swinging from right to center to left, to allegations of more or less corruption and all kinds of other problems. We have got to know our neighbors and work with them. And today it's a big part of my life, what we do in the Caribbean, whether it's my own foundation's work in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, the long-time relationship I've had with the Dominican Republic, a wonderful trip that I took last year or earlier this year, to the Galapagos, where 30 years ago, I got the presidents of nearby Chile, Argentina, and Brazil to support me in urging the Ecuadorian government to protect the fishing stocks around the Ecuadorian coast and also around the Galapagos. Today, 30 years later, the Ecuadorian fishing businesses all got together and supported a no fishing area zone of a couple of 100 miles around the Galapagos and a big fishing free highway that goes from the Galapagos north and east to Colombia and Panama and the southern part of Costa Rica. It was exciting for me. And finally, I got to see the giant tortoises. So I think that when we do these things, we have to realize that we're not just helping our own people, we're helping the hemisphere. And in the case of preserving Amazonia and the quality of our oceans, we're helping the whole world. I think there's a lot more still to be done. We cannot walk away from Colombia at a time when the combined impact of COVID and the turmoil in Venezuela has made them more vulnerable to the reemergence of narco trafficking and the power of gang violence to undermine democracy. We need to be there with them side by side, all of us. Meanwhile, our students need to be learning these things. They need to know that it's not just a phrase to say we have to be involved with the rest of the world. That getting a Georgetown education, which teaches you about other countries and other cultures, particularly in the Americas, is not just something that should help your career. It has to build a state of mind among our people that what we have in common is more important than our interesting differences. And I say this at a time when we're going through the World Cup, and I realize that interesting differences for some people are all that matter. But we can laugh about it because we know there are bigger fish to fry now. So I want to encourage all of you. I enjoyed the end of the conversation in the previous panel, which I was able to hear from my home. So once again, I'm proud of my alma mater, grateful to President DeGioia, grateful to Rolando and Monica and all the people who will support this Institute of the Americas, and much more hopeful that we can revive the vitality of our democratic governance and our ability to produce shared prosperity, and that we can find a way through this period of enormous division and conflict back to doing things in a more cooperative spirit. And if it happens, I believe that it will happen in part because of institutes and ways of thinking like those that we celebrate at Georgetown today. So enjoy your dinner, have a great time, and thank you very, very much for what you're doing here.